He did. He knew what it meant. But he also knew God hadn't worked out the circumstances for it to happen. And he said, you know what? Who am I to marry the king's daughter? And Saul's daughter Michal loved King David. Saul found out about it and he said, I'll kill him this way. He made an offer. He said, if you get 100 foreskins of the Philistines, you go out and you kill 100 Philistines and bring proof of it, then I'll let you marry my daughter. David went out and killed 200 and brought proof of it. You think it was just to irritate Saul? I'm moving into your household. I'm here to be a thorn in your side until you give up the kingdom. I'm here to supplant. I'm here to take. It is significant, isn't it, that David married into the king's household? Michal had a real opportunity here. Saul was careful about that to make sure that God couldn't give him a throne forever. And here David's daughter Saul is given to him. Verse 28, Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul, verse 29, was yet more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines went forth, and it came to pass after they went forth, that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was much set by. Saul spake to Jonathan his son, and to all his servants, that they should kill David. Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David, and Jonathan told David, saying, Saul my father seeketh to kill thee. Now therefore I pray thee, take heed to thyself until the morning, and abide in a secret place. And here we find this account that we looked at last week. I want to point out something I'd said before we finished this morning. I was going to mention the contrast between Jonathan and Saul, and even David and Saul. I want to point something out to you. It was not natural for Jonathan to take a liking to David. It was not natural for Jonathan to, as the Scripture says, have his soul knit with David. The first time Jonathan met David, he took off his armor, he took off his clothing, his girdle, the things that were symbolic that he was a prince, and he put them on David, recognizing that God had called David to be the king of Israel. And that's not natural. It's not natural to be a Jonathan and say, well, I'm not interested in holding an office that God has not called me to. How many of you would give up your right for whatever it is that you value simply because God's given it to another? You know, parents, here's some application. How many of you are willing to give up your children? Saul wasn't. And yet his son Jonathan, soul was knit to David. But I want to point out something to you as well. It was unnatural for David to be friendly to Jonathan. Jonathan was a friend to David, and we say, well, that's unique. That's really something that the son of the king would be a friend to David. What about from David's perspective? What about from David's perspective and his friendship to Jonathan? What is the thing that earthly rulers do when they want to be a king and make sure that they're uncontested? Remember what Gideon's sons did? After he died, the children of Israel tried to make Gideon king, and he said no. First thing that happened when he died was that one of his sons tried to kill all his other sons. Probably only one guy in Israel tougher than Jonathan, that's David. And from man's perspective, if you're looking to be king, the thing to do is not to fraternize with the person who's expected by man to be king. Do you see David's attitude here? He's not trying to open his own doors. He's not trying to make his own way. And I don't know about you, but if I were David and I'd been there when Saul had prophesied, Saul probably prophesied, you're the future king of Israel. I believe that. He'd been anointed by Samuel, who was the recognized man of God, to be king of Israel. And to me, if I were David, and I didn't have a heart after God, I had a heart after man, I'd say this whole plan of God's isn't going to work with Jonathan alive. And I can't be friends with him. naturally there would be jealousy between David toward Jonathan. I'm just telling you naturally. Knowing what he knew, it did not make sense to be friends with Jonathan. But Jonathan wasn't his enemy. And David had an understanding that was different than most men. Do you remember Abraham? He was saved by faith, and he believed by faith the promise that he never saw in his lifetime. But when God said, Abraham, in your seed all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed, Abraham went out and tried to make a son. He said, Sarah can't have a son. He said, well, God, how about Eliezer? Can I make him my son? It's Eliezer, right? I didn't say that wrong, did I? You're looking at me funny. Maybe I said something wrong. Well, then he said, what about Hagar? And he tried all kinds of things, and God said, no, my way. Do you know David just said, God, I believe you about this thing. And he didn't need to be anything and to have anything. Let me ask you a question. What is the greatest honor? What is the greater honor? A heritage in whom all the nations of the earth would be blessed, or the privilege of being in the line of the one who would be the Christ, to whom, through your seed, God Himself would be born? There's a lot of implications to this throne of David. And David's conclusion was that God's going to have to work this out. And that's the last thing I want to point out to you this morning as we conclude by way of application. Question I asked first of all was this. When you're right, you've behaved yourself wisely and you're wronged, what do? The answer ought to be the same thing you've always done. Behave yourself wisely. You ought to do right. When you're right, keep doing right and you'll still be right. You know, the devil knows, Satan knows about this matter, this thing. He uses it a lot. Friend, I want to tell you something. When people attack the preacher, it's always on something bogus. It really is. It's usually silly. It's nonsense. I've had people come to me and accuse me of the most ridiculous things. They're just silly. And anybody that knows the facts or knows anything, they just laugh. I mean, they just be like, are you serious? I've had to say that before. I've said, I'm trying to determine whether you're... I don't know if you're jesting or if you're really serious about this. And then the reaction many times is to really kind of let them know where it stands and how it is. And you know that they didn't come to you on the bogus thing. They came to you to get you to do wrong so that they could talk about what you did wrong in response to their wrongdoing. Isn't it interesting that people that do wrong, watch this in school. See how this worked. I know how it worked when I was in school. They don't do it anymore. I think they call it bullying or something like that. But kid picks on a kid, does something to him, so he does something back, and then they end up in a scuffle. Who ends up in trouble? They both do. And what do they both say? He started it. Now let me ask you a question. How often does the one who started it say, you know, that's right, I am fully to blame here. I did start it. Here they've got their black eye, their bleeding nose. Well, a man started it, but he hit me. What do they focus on? So what if I started it? Who cares about what I did wrong? It matters what you did wrong. Right? How many of you are like that? You're caught goofing off at work, and your supervisor comes and says a sharp, sarcastic comment, and sarcasm should not be in the workplace. My friend, sarcasm belongs when you're goofing off. When you're goofing off, the issue is you're goofing off. And you're stealing from those people. Well, you know, everybody else, no. I'm talking about you. And I would just tell you something. Satan knows that the thing to get God's people to do wrong is just simply come and wrong them. And then they do wrong, and then that becomes the issue. That's how the media works.